Welcome, and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Colonel Paul Hessling, the Chief of Plans, Programs, and Operations Division at the National Guard Bureau. Later, we'll hear from Pratik Desai. He's the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Global Public Sector at Here Technologies. So, Colonel, the first thing I wanted to ask you about is the comparison of data collection, location data collection, and all that sort of stuff from the private sector and the public sector. I understand that DoD probably takes in more information than maybe any other entity in the world. However, the way it deals with that information may be completely different than the private sector. So could you just give us a little bit of insight into that?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Scott, for having me today. And certainly on that, you're right. There is a enormous amount of data out there that gets taken in. And the key is getting that processed and the proper analysis done and the output of that data by the analysts. So while we have multiple sources that we take our data from, mostly federal agency partners and inside the DoD, the key really is getting it in the right hands of the right analyst with the skill set to decipher that data, figure out what's useful and what's not, and then assess that data and figure out what kind of decision making can be made from what's available. The hardest part, though, as you hit on, is the amount of data that we do get. It's data coming from every direction, some of it useful, some of it not, and how to sort that out is key in getting the operation and seeing success in wherever the mission is.
How do you try and make some of those decisions? Are you using algorithms? Are you harnessing AI? Are you working with your private sector partners?
So we do work with inside the DoD, who, of course, as you know, works with many private public sector partners who come through the DoD either through a grant or the contracting acquisition mechanisms that are available to them. But once they're inside as approved partner inside the system, are mostly federal agency partners with the National Guard Bureau, we do use artificial intelligence processes and algorithms, not being written here at the National Guard Bureau, but in our DoD partners who specialize in that. And we provide them that data to do that analysis and that artificial intelligence to give us some predictions on where maybe the fire is going to be, or where the flood's going to happen, where the most catastrophic event is going to take place that might necessitate rescue of personnel or people, of public citizens, or property.
Do you ever have an issue with too much data? As I was saying, DoD collects a lot of data, and it has a lot of sensors everywhere. Is there a time with this data that you need to create data ponds out of that big data lake?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. We're getting data, as we previously mentioned, whether it's from the United States Geological Survey, whether it's from NASA, whether it's from FEMA, could be the Civil Air Patrol in a particular region, wherever we're responding to, or some DoD sensor that's out there. Intaking data, unfortunately, in our particular response efforts, generally a domestic response, trying to save lives, protect property from a hurricane, flood, wildfire event, it's geotagged. So all that data we get is already geotagged from whatever that sensor of choice is that comes to us. So then we can really try to sort it out on the location that we're trying to focus on and get the heart of the matter of whether, this is an area where we think is all clear. This is an area where there's still people who need rescued, and then dispatch the right piece of equipment or asset to protect that piece of property or save that civilian life who maybe is trapped on a roof or whatever the case may be.
So you're in a very interesting position being in the National Guard because you work on state, local, and federal levels. Really, you can be called up at any time for any sort of issue, and you guys really are the Swiss Army knife of the military. How, as you've looked at these different sorts of natural disasters and the different areas of government, what's sort of the top needs that you see in each of those levels, that local level all the way up to the federal level?
Yeah, so I would say information sharing and sharing each other's data and clear communication. It's important to have a common operating picture that's accessible to everyone. So in the National Guard Bureau, like you mentioned, we're a lot of times focused on a domestic operation inside the state, responding to either a wildfire, a flood or hurricane, or some sort of man-made or a natural disaster. So there are many other partnering agencies that we've mentioned here already that have tools and assets and personnel who are trying to look at this same problem set, and really having a clear communication and open lines of availability to share information. So a shared situational awareness of the problem set, and then the specific data that needs to be looked at that will help us all obtain our common goal, whatever, depending on whatever that is that we may be looking at.
When it comes to interoperability, is it hard to work sometimes on a local level? Maybe, a small city doesn't have the resources that obviously the federal government does. They may not have an AI department or something like that. Are you still able to work in between those different layers?
Yeah, here in the National Guard Bureau, we are. We actually developed with some partners a tool called the Domestic Awareness Assessment Response Tool, commonly referred to as DART. And that is a tool that was developed here in the National Guard Bureau with our partners. And it takes us down from the federal, state, local, and tribal levels. So it could be a county sheriff's department in some state could access this tool. It's a web-based tool. You request access to it. You're given a username and password, and all that data, whether it's a full motion video, whether it's whatever type of data it is, we can feed into DART. We have a pretty complex organized filing system by event that's taking place, and then we just simply give access down to the local level, state level, and federal partners. So that's one thing that National Guard Bureau I think has done that we should be and are proud of, is creating this tool that can be shared from the local to the federal level that's easily accessible. It doesn't require some sort of, card that you have in the DoD or access to get to. You can get to it simply by having a need, requesting a password and username, getting it, and then you can get to the data, and everyone can get to that at once.
So if there's one thing that DoD is good at, it's planning, and planning's right in your job title. So there's a lot of situations I'm sure that you plan for. How does location data, build into that? How do you bring that data into your plans and use it in a dynamic way?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, there's many national level exercises that we train on annually. Of course, most states have exercises ongoing all the time, whether it be the Cascadia subduction zone or the New Madrid seismic zone or a floodplain or wildfire somewhere in the West. So we kind of, train as we fight. That's the unique thing about the National Guard, is we're able to utilize our warfighting skill set that the soldiers and airmen are trained to go do their federal Title X mission, go to war in some deployment scenario. And we can use those tool sets and those skill sets in a domestic operations effort, whether it's responding to something inside the United States, again, some type of disaster. So just that train as we fight and putting the emphasis on that dual use of those capabilities of both personnel and systems and equipment really gives us an advantage and puts us in a unique situation to respond to any community across the United States.
And are there any disasters that you've been changing your view or plans around? We've seen these superstorms of hurricanes being more prevalent. The wildfires are getting so much more, bigger than they were in the past in the West. How are you dealing with those sorts of things? And is there any sort of location prediction that you have with that as well?
Yeah, so we're having to adjust. As you mentioned, hurricanes seem more prevalent. We had a record year of hurricanes make landfall this year in the United States. We had record number of wildfires out west. We kind of have stopped referring to wildfire season and just look at it as we have a wildfire year now. So we're constantly trying to make adjustments and position our training events so we can do training that may be real world applicable to some response effort that we're responding to or training on, that best positions us to respond to that wildfire when it does actually happen. The same thing to the hurricanes. So as you mentioned, they're more and more prevalent. It seems like the seasons are longer, they're more frequent, and they're sort of an enduring response versus, maybe just a week here or a few days there. And we are having to make adjustments to that.
So just sort of sewing up this, everything we've just talked about in a way, public safety officials have a lot they need to take into account. They have, data, planning, practices, whatever's happening with the natural disaster. How are they sharing best practices? Is there one book someone can go to and just say, all right, this is what I follow? Or, what are they doing in that situation?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it would be great if there was one book that we can follow, but we have done better in the last several years. We do have after action reviews with the multiple agencies that respond to whatever events it was with the hurricane or with the fire or with the Corona-19 virus, whatever it is. So we're doing lessons learned and after action reviews and information sharing and going back and looking at best practices and things that worked and didn't work. And again, it goes back to that sharing of that information. If one state or one section or one area in the National Guard was responding to a particular response, some of the best practices may be able to be applied to a different response. So just sharing that information again and making it available is key. Of course, like you said, it'd be great if there was one book that we could just all go to and find the answer, but unfortunately that's not the case. So we try to compile that data. We share what we have. We encourage our partners to share. We're fortunate to have the great partners that we do who openly share information with us. And it makes it easier for us all to respond and work together when the time comes.
And those best practices, those are easily accessible for, really anyone from the local level all the way to the federal?
They are. Back to the DART tool that I referred to earlier, there's a library in there of lessons learned by event, by year. We've had that tool going on 5 years now. So you can go back and look at a hurricane, Harvey or Irma that happened a couple of years back, or you can go back and look at a hurricane that just happened this past season and find some of those best practices and lessons learned. And that's why they're so important to capture, and they're to make accessible and readily accessible to everyone. So that new person, when you do move on into another position or you're doing something else, that your predecessor or your follow-on can go back and find that data and implement those best practices and try to improve on those.
Great. Well, we're going to take a quick break here. My guest is Colonel Paul Hessling. He's the Chief of Plans, Programs, and Operations Division at the National Guard Bureau. I'm your moderator, Scott Massioni, on the discussion Zoning In on Information and Location in Government, sponsored by Here Technologies on Federal News Network.